and we looked at desire, and it was a very complicated topic, because at what point is something sin? And so we'll review that a little bit in today's class. And just as a summary statement, what I'll say is that we are responsible for the actual sins that we commit, thought, word, and deed. Those are actual sins. Even our thoughts, right? Sinful thoughts are sins. But we are also sinful, or we are also guilty for our sin nature that brings those sins about. We've inherited that, but it is our own guilt. And if any of you do anything and you said, why did I just do that? Or why did I just think that? And you grieve it, you understand. There's something inside of you, a root that allows it to kind of blossom, and we realize we're not who we're supposed to be. And the point of this is, it's saying that not only the things that we do, or thought, word, and deed, but also who we are in the fall, we are guilty of. Okay? And then we are renewed in Jesus Christ, and we are being sanctified, which Pablo did last week, which means it's progressive. We're getting little by little better and better, and sometimes it doesn't always look like that. And sometimes it's not always a straight line. As a matter of fact, it's almost probably never a straight line. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it's great success, and other times it's long valleys. But the progress in sanctification is increasing. We are growing in holiness. We are growing in our conformity to Christ till one day we actually will be. We'll be glorified. We won't have that other nature anymore, the sin nature. And so that is our hope. But we can count on that the Spirit is working inside of us. So I say all that to kind of preface what I'm going to say now, because I've had a few requests about this decision in the denomination that you may be familiar with, and what does it mean and what does it not mean. And so there was a significant decision at the denominational level. The SJC stands for Standing Judicial Commission. Think of it as the Supreme Court, but for the PCA. Okay? The difference is, we are a grassroots denomination. Like, churches are responsible for themselves. We don't really report to or answer to the presbytery or the denomination. There is a sense that we do, but like, they don't have a say in what we do. The presbytery doesn't, and the denomination doesn't. They only can step in when there's a violation of the Constitution, which is our Book of Church Order or the Westminster Confession of Faith. And the only time they can even step in is if there's an appeal to something a church has done. Okay? So think of the local church as a city, think of the presbytery as a state, and think of the General Assembly as the United States. Right? And so cities may have their own courts, and then the state has a court, and then the United States has the Supreme Court. That's kind of like us. Us, Meadowview, the session is a court. Then the presbytery, which is all the churches in the triad, Piedmont Triad Presbytery, that covers Greensboro, Winston-Salem, us, that forms the next court up. But presbytery can't come in here and tell us what to do. However, if we err in something that we do, a case, and one of the members involved in that case appeals it to presbytery, presbytery can look at it. Now here's the key. Presbytery cannot overrule us. They can only say whether or not we followed process. You understand? They might say, you're going to have to process properly. in his life, but he identifies as gay because that's his orientation, is what he says. And so this is, in some sense, Greg Johnson and that whole thing is what has brought up all the overtures and all these discussions and even this human sexuality report. And so the General Assembly in the July meeting affirmed the report we're going through, that sheet that I handed out to you, as this is biblically sound and is what our denomination agrees with on all those topics: marriage, original sin, desire, sin, all of it, temptation, sanctification. And so that document that we're going through is a good document that defines what we believe. So what was the case against Greg Johnson then? Well, there's still some question as to what he really believes. On the one hand, he says, this is my experience, so he'll call it his orientation, but I don't act on it because I know it's a sin, which is exactly what a prideful person would say when pride comes up. I often struggle with pride, but I mortify it, okay? But then when he's ministering to the surrounding area, and he's in an area that has a lot of same-sex attracted people, a lot of trans people, and it's often confusing in what he says. And so the question is, what does he really believe? So there were charges brought against him in his presbytery. The presbytery investigated the charges and said, there's no grounds here for a case because he believes what we believe as a denomination. So they went through the process and sent it up to the General Assembly, the SJC, the Standing Judicial Commission, to say, Missouri hasn't acted. They've shirked their responsibility. We want General Assembly to take original jurisdiction of this case because Missouri won't. So do you get what's happening here? They're saying, the only reason General Assembly can get involved is because they're saying that his presbytery won't do what they're supposed to do. So the General Assembly looked at it, evaluated everything, and they ruled that the Missouri presbytery did exactly what it was supposed to do. That's all this case is saying. And to clarify it, the four charges, so these were the issues. Did presbytery violate BCO, Book of Church Order 31.2, in the manner of its investigation of the allegations? So BCO 31.2, the Book of Church Order, says that if there's a reason for an investigation must happen, and if there's a strong presumption of guilt, then a trial must happen. Missouri did the investigation. They chose not to go to the trial because there's no strong presumption of guilt. Okay? So did presbytery violate that in how they did the investigation? And then number two, did Missouri presbytery clearly err at its meeting when it declined to commence process on these allegations? So this is what Greg Johnson was charged with. Denying that same-sex attraction is sinful and thereby fails to properly distinguish misery from sin, which gives rise to it. So they're saying Greg Johnson denies that the same-sex attraction is sinful. Now this goes back to that desire class that I taught you that says not only are the actions from our illicit desires sin, but the desire themselves is sin. So what does Greg Johnson believe on that? Well, the reason that charge came up is because he would often equate having this desire as an unwanted desire. Similar to maybe an alcoholic who is predisposed to it, something he might be born with. Yes, sociology can add to it, but whatever it is, he doesn't want it. And so they're saying, well, that means you're saying that it's sinful. It's not sinful. You're denying the sinfulness of it. It says TE, that's Teaching Elder Johnson, compromises and dishonors his identity in Christ by self-identifying as a same-sex attracted man. So this report is alleging that if you say you are same-sex attracted or gay, that's a violation because your identity is in Christ, not in your sin. Number three, Johnson denies God's purpose and power to sanctify same-sex attracted believers by minimizing the pursuit of orientation change from homosexual to heterosexual. What they're saying there is, Greg Johnson is saying, if you are, quote, I'm using his term, right? If you're gay, you'll always be gay. God can't change that. Now, he's never said that, but that's what they're alleging he said, which would deny sanctification, that we are growing in holiness, which in our growth in holiness, there should be a lessening of disordered desires. The believer should experience that over time, okay? It's important to note that even our confession states, and guys like John Owen wrote in Mortification of Sin, those desires will probably never be gone in this life. There'll always be some wrong desire for sure. But the best we could do is mortify them when they rear their head, and they should decrease progressively over time. But is Greg Johnson denying that God will sanctify and could even remove these desires? That's the question. The fourth one is he cannot meet the biblical above reproach qualification for eldership, since homosexual inclinations are sin proper and more heinous for being against nature, and since he identifies as a homosexually inclined man. So this gets at the fact that is this one sin the one, again, not acted upon, right? Nobody's saying you can live this out. But is the fact that you have this disordered desire the one disqualifying feature, and then you can't be an elder? And so the General Assembly looked at how Missouri did the investigation, and they said Missouri did not err in following process. I should tell you that if another presbytery did this investigation, they may have found him guilty of some of these charges, and the General Assembly would look at it and say, that presbytery did not err in their process. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's up to the presbytery. Now, for our own satisfaction in this report, you can read, and I gave you the link in your thing, the allegations, teaching and what Greg Johnson has said to respond to the allegations. So teaching Elder Johnson denies that same-sex attraction is sinful and thereby fails to distinguish it. So here's his response. Greg Johnson: I don't recall saying that same-sex attraction is a morally neutral condition. I've repeatedly stated otherwise. Anytime I sense an internal sexual or romantic pull toward anyone God has not given me, including any male by definition, I recognize that pull for what it is. It's an effect of the fall, yes, but more precisely, it is the pull of what St. Paul terms the flesh. It's a motion of the internal corruption that remains in the believer throughout this life. This corruption of nature during this life remains, the temptation is original corruption and is properly called sin. So he's charged with something and he's answered what he believes. And his beliefs conform to what our confession teaches. Now, we might have other issues with him, but this decision does not change what our denomination believes. So that's just what I want to make clear. And if you want to research it further, again, you can read it. But what does our denomination believe? Well, it believes the study report we're going through, which has already established these things. Now, that doesn't minimize that there are issues going on in the PCA where people have blurred the lines for what they call missional reasons, and those things need to be addressed. You know, and if there is a slippery slope, and if we're on it, we're going to have to deal with it. But this decision has been blown up to be more than what it is. So, yeah, Lee. Yes, so he's like on his mission seems to be that the church for the last 30 years has terribly abused people with gender dysphoria, sexual inclinations that aren't heterosexual, and he's right. Gay bashing, I mean, all you got to do is look at Westboro Baptist for some of the worst manifestations of this. The church has made homosexuality to be the worst sin, and yet Christ was extremely gracious toward people with sexual sin and extremely hard on religious people. And so his point is, he has put himself out there. He didn't have to do this. He only came out like 2 or 3 years ago. He was successful and had written books before this. He didn't have to come out, but he felt that his story could help others find grace in Christ, where those people believe that God hates them. Now we know God, God's against all unregenerate people, but like uniquely God hates them more because they have this desire that they don't even want for the most part. And so that's why he is out there, trying to love that community, and I disagree with a lot of the way he goes about that. I mean, his church hosted a transvestite festival on the grounds, not in the building. We have things we could disagree with, but his beliefs are orthodox, and he's not teaching unorthodox beliefs, but his practice blurs the lines, and it also often communicates things that I wouldn't want to communicate. And that's why, like, Rosario Butterfield disagrees with him, because she does not identify as a lesbian Christian who happens to marry a man. She knows that desire, like any desire, is a disordered desire, and you just mortify it. But she will acknowledge that she had an attraction and experience a desire that was disordered. She's very clear to distinguish between identity and desire. He seems to blur them, but if asked specific questions, he'll clarify. So, yeah. Anyway, I know some of you wanted me to talk about that, and so it's right in line with everything we're talking about. So, but to this class, okay. We talked about desire, and I want to re-highlight some of these points because this is so, yeah. Well, so the first step was this human sexuality report to define to the world what we believe. And that human sexuality report passed last summer, so that's on the books. Yeah. And it further clarifies that, this is what this class we're teaching is what was approved. So that's a faithful statement. So where we're at is when individual churches want to violate that, how do we deal with that, And I just can tell you that the elders, we got our finger on the pulse of where we're going as a denomination, There's 2 overtures that are coming up for vote. That's what you're thinking of this summer. They may or may not pass, but nobody thinks they'll change anything in practice, because a presbytery that wants to do what they want to do will still do what they want to do. And so it's, some churches have left in the last couple years, the PCA. Some have left because they want to be more liberal, and some have left because they're afraid of the progressive drift that they see, not only with issues of sexuality, but how race is being addressed, and our doctrine or they take a more egalitarian approach to the male and female, and we're complementarian, and there's all kinds of reasons. So that drift. But as you see churches trying to be missional and transform the culture and reach the city, you see that's where the conservatives, myself among them, are more and more uncomfortable with the methods they're using. And that's really what it is. It's a philosophy of ministry difference, not a difference in belief. But because there's a different philosophy of ministry, it often looks, it's hard to say it's compromising our beliefs, but it looks like it. And that's concerning because of the slippery slope. So, but right now we're just, we got to just see what's going to happen. Yeah. That answer you, Wayne? Yeah. This March I went to, so Gospel Reformation Network, .com or .net, Gospel Reformation Network. You can look it up. I went to their conference in Briarwood in March. They're the guys, the group that's on the conservative saying we're gonna hold the line, you know. And so we follow them. I went to their conference, and we'll see where the denomination goes. But this decision hasn't changed anything. Yeah. Okay. Desire, because all the classes we've had, like, okay, it's great to define what the image of God is and what marriage is, and it is. I mean, it's beautiful. It's the foundation for everything. But the truth is, like, we know that, right? And so we've reaffirmed it, but desire and temptation is really where the confusion is, the discussion is, because the whole debate we talked about in that timeline, like, is it a choice to be same-sex attracted? Is it, you know, and we already looked at all that. It's not a choice. But then how do we understand the desire, right? And so many, you know, some people were saying to have the predisposition to homosexual desire is not a sin, only if it's acted out. And different Christian denominations believe different things about this. That's that word concupiscence. And the Roman Catholics. The Roman Catholic teaching is it's not a sin unless it's joined with an act of the will. In other words, you agree to do it, or you agree to pursue it. And in our denomination, in Reformed circles, we said, no, we have a sin nature, and so the desire itself is sin. And that's what this statement 4 was saying. Therefore, the experience of same-sex attraction is not morally neutral. The attraction is an expression of original or indwelling sin that must be repented of and put to death. So, concupiscence, again, was the impure thoughts and desires arising in us prior to and apart from a conscious act of the will. Okay? So not if you just consciously lust after something, but whatever it is inside of you that would even allow for that or entice that. These desires within us are not mere weaknesses or inclinations, even if we're born with them. I mean, clearly we're born with them, right? I mean, the same way a person who may be born and genetically for whatever reason, and again, there's nature and nurture in this, but if somebody is like Greg Johnson, who's from the very earliest age, he experienced an attraction toward men, even if you could make a genetic connection to it, it's still sin. The same way, I'm predisposed to sins, and you're predisposed to sins. And there may be sin struggles that you have to fight and put to death constantly. Maybe it's pride. Maybe it's anger. Maybe it's whatever. Every sin, there's a sense that we don't want it, right? I mean, Christians don't want it. I know people with anger problems, they don't want to be angry. And so whatever it is inside them that's bringing that about is itself sin. That's the idea of concupiscence. But this should move us to compassion and understanding. Moreover, it is true for all of us that sin can be both unchosen bondage and idolatrous rebellion at the same time. It's a tension. It's unchosen, and yet it is rebellion. So if you have a struggle with anger, and maybe you don't want to just get angry for no reason, that's unchosen. But you got to satisfy that desire to be angry, and you got to lash out at somebody. I mean, you see, you can't do what our society said. Well, if we could explain where this comes from, then they're really just a victim of it, and then they're just absolved from it. The Bible never absolves us from our predispositions. Okay, and so in the Westminster Confession of Faith, where, you know, it's funny, like we have this whole document and everything we're doing, but it's all in the Westminster Confession of Faith, which was written hundreds of years ago. And it talks about these two things. So you'll see underlined couplets in each one of these sentences, underlined in yellow. So from this original corruption that we inherit from Adam and Eve, whereby we are utterly indisposed, disabled, and made opposite to all good, and wholly inclined to all evil. That's what we call total depravity. We're not as bad as we could be, but every one of our faculties is corrupted. From original corruption do proceed all actual transgressions. And so we can't, some people say, well, is it an actual sin? Well, in our mind, we think that means, is it really sin? But when the confession uses it, and when we use it religiously, we're saying actual, meaning something we do, an act of the will, thought, word, or deed, as opposed to original corruption, which is the sin nature. But like as we've said, we're guilty for both. So again, number 5 in chapter 6 of Westminster Confession. This corruption of nature, yet both itself and all the motions thereof are truly and properly sin that we're responsible for. The motions thereof are the actual or acted out sins. The corruption of nature is our indwelling sin. Again, you see it in statement 6. Every sin, both original and actual. Again, actual meaning something that happened, an act. Do you get what I'm saying? Okay. So that's the review. Okay, we read James 1 at the beginning, which talks about us experiencing trials and temptations. So sinful desire is sin. Matthew 5:28, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So sins of the heart is actually sin. It is not what goes in, this is Jesus in Matthew 15. It's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person. So of course the Jewish people believed in everything was clean and unclean. There were clean people and unclean people. Clean things to touch, unclean things, and then clean foods to eat. That's kosher and unclean. Jesus says, what goes in the mouth doesn't defile the person, doesn't make you unclean, but what comes out of the mouth. But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart. And this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile. So it's originating again in the heart because of indwelling sin, original corruption. So to statement 6, which builds on what we've just said. This is temptation. Because why this is a part of this class, because James 1 says, we're all tempted and avoid the temptation because don't let it, develop into desire that is lived out. And it makes it sound like the temptation itself is not sin. And then we know that Jesus, is tempted in all ways and yet without sin. So is temptation sin? And again, this goes back to the desire question. Because you can't have temptation if there's no desire. And so what this statement says, and again, building on Scripture and Westminster Confession, we affirm that Scripture speaks of temptation in different ways. There are some temptation God gives us in the form of morally neutral trials. What would be a morally neutral trial? A temptation that would not be sinful. Well, that's good to explain that. I mean, that's deeper than I was thinking. Yeah. So why a loss of a job? What? Yeah. The loss of a job, loss of security can create all kinds of. But is the desire for security a sin? No, right? So you're desiring something that's good. And yet you could be tempted that could go in the wrong direction. A very simple one I was thinking of is, let's say you're on a diet and you can't eat that wonderful, whatever that red cake was. I think it was cherry. What was it? And you're tempted to eat it. You clearly have a desire for that. That's not a sin. Yeah. Right, and so we're separating desire from temptation. Every temptation has a desire behind it. Okay? And so even, the desire for companionship is fulfilled well when you have a spouse. It's not when you seek that out through sexual means. The desire to provide for your family is good and lived out well when you have a good job that pays you well and it's honest work. It's not when you go gambling or you go steal the money. You see, so there's always going to be a desire that has a good expression and then a twisted, because every desire, C.S. Lewis says this, that every desire we have has a good fulfillment, and the problem is we twist those things. Yeah, Leela. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. So if your desire is to, anytime we want to use whatever the ends of that is to replace what God is supposed to be in our life, then it's the wrong thing. So my point is there are morally neutral trials, okay? And again, a simple one is if you've decided you're going to be on a diet and you see a piece of cake that you want, you could be tempted to eat it. But that's not what we're talking about as far as sin goes. Okay. And other temptations God never gives us. Wait a minute. There are some temptations God gives us in the form of morally neutral trials. So things happen in life, trials in life. They're morally neutral. How we respond to them can be good or bad, sin or not. But there are also other temptations that God never gives us because they arise from within as morally illicit desires. I got to get through it, Jesse. Okay? So when we read a verse like James that talks about trials, or even Jesus being tempted in all ways, we can't view temptation as one just bucket. There's different types of temptations. We're tempted to good things, and there's nothing wrong, or morally neutral things that could twist us in our pursuit of it, but they themselves are not. And then there's morally illicit desires that are always sin. Okay. Then in the blue one, when temptations come from without, the temptation itself is not sin unless unless you enter into the temptation. So there's some things that are outside of us that have the potential to entice us. And the fact that that is there and it's from outside of us and our heart is not drawing us to it, it's not necessarily a sin. But when the temptation arises from within, it is our own act and is rightly called sin. And let's keep building this out. There is an important degree of moral difference between temptation to sin and giving in to sin. So we do have to say that. Even though Jesus says if you lust, you've committed adultery, he's not saying that lust is, humanly speaking, as bad as adultery. He's saying, according to the law of God, you are guilty of adultery. But clearly, just ask your wife or your husband if there's a difference if you lust or if you actually commit adultery. And the worse we sin against other people, the more aggravated the sin becomes. And the worse we sin against nature, how God created things, the more aggravated it becomes. There are more heinous sins. In Protestant, Catholics have like venial sins and mortal sins, and Protestants said, oh no, there's only one kind of sin. Yes, every sin, the smallest sin, sends you to hell. But we acknowledge there are more grievous sins. Okay. Even when the temptation is itself and expressing it, okay, while our goal is the weakening and lessening of internal temptation to sin, Christians should feel their greatest responsibility not for the fact that such temptations occur, but for thoroughly and immediately fleeing and resisting the temptations when they arise. This is so important for you guys, for us, because I don't know about you, but if you're battling a sin and it keeps rearing its head, and if you feel shame in that and discouraged, and beaten down about it. And it doesn't just have to be sexual sin. We always think, it could just be how you respond to a loved one. And then for me, sometimes that can crush me because it's like Romans 7. Why, Lord? Why do Christians should feel the greatest responsibility not for the fact for those temptations occur, but thoroughly and immediately flee resisting the temptation. Romans 8:1, there's therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free from the law of sin and death. Therefore, put to death the deeds. So put them to death, but live in the freedom of Christ. This is why this is important is because people who have struggled with this, and like the video of Ray Boltz, like for years just felt a shame that wouldn't go away because they still felt this. Even though Ray Boltz lived a committed life to a wife for 30 years, he felt the shame that he still had sinful desires. And because he wasn't taught good Reformed theology, he left the faith. We avoid entering into the temptation by refusing to internally ponder and entertain the proposal and desire to actual sin. So this is why putting, the things on your phone, having accountability partners, we do whatever we can to not give in to the sin. That's just what we do. It doesn't make us better Christians. It just helps us to live according to that way the Lord wants us to live. So. Okay. So again, the different types of temptations. There's morally neutral trials like hunger and thirst and being tired. And there's morally illicit, which is bad, like sexual desires for somebody not your spouse or being prideful or angry. Some desires originate internally. That is sin whether it's acted on or not. So when you feel yourself lusting for something or just angry, that's sin. You're already there. But if it's externally, it comes into your world. It's kind of like out there. If there's no movement toward it, it's not sin. And this is what Jesus experienced. We're going to look at that. Okay. So statement 8 talks about impeccability because, see, this all developed because of the issues. How do we view these things? What about Jesus? So this says the incarnate Son of God neither sinned in thought, word, deed, or desire, nor had the possibility of sinning. That's hard for people to understand, and that's what we believe. Christ experienced temptation passively in the form of trials and the devil's entreaties, not actively in the form of disordered desires. Christ had only the suffering part of temptation. We have the sinning part. He had no inward disposition or inclination unto the least evil, being perfect in all graces and all their operations at all times. Nevertheless, Christ endured from without the real soul-wrenching temptations which qualified him to be our sympathetic high priest. Christ assumed a human nature that was susceptible to suffering and death. He was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And so, we know of the clear case where Christ was tempted by Satan, the temptation of Christ, right? They were obviously external because Satan was bringing them into his consciousness. And what was Satan tempting him with? Well, hold the pride for a sec. But the other ones. Satan was tempting him with good things. And the problem would be to go about them through the wrong means. So Jesus was clearly hungry. There's no sin in the fact that his body and he wanted food. And there's no sin that he wanted more food the more Satan told him, I'll give you bread. But he resisted the temptation because he understood that to use his power for his own glory in that moment, he was living as a human. And so he wouldn't do that. So that is different than the sinful desires that we feel. And I would say that even external desires, Christ, external temptations, he didn't respond sinfully to those. So what I want to do now is I'm going to show this clip that tries to explain that. And now this may be better than my explanation for some of you, and this may be terrible for others of you. Kevin DeYoung is talking to pastors, and so he's speaking very theologically, but he'll make a lot of the same points. And same thing, when you got to go get your kids in 10 minutes, make sure you do that.